This is Dunkirk, the seaport on the northern coast of France. Today, there are few obvious reminders that it was once the scene of one of the great dramas of the Second World War, the so-called Miracle of Dunkirk, when an entire army was ferried to safety by an armada of British ships. The beaches stretch wide and pale under a quiet sky. Children play where soldiers once bled. The tide comes in and goes out, indifferent to what happened here, as tides always are. It was a glorious defeat that raised the spirits of the British nation but confirmed the superiority of the German army. And its story begins not with generals or politicians, but with two old men who have come back to remember. But more than 60 years after the events that made this place a byword for both catastrophe and deliverance, two old men have come back. One is English, one is German. In May and June of 1940, they were on opposite sides of one of the most desperate episodes of the war. Now, for the first time, they are walking these beaches together. Bob Pendleton was a signalman in the 46th Nottingham Division. Georg Lehrmann served in the 20th Artillery Regiment, one of the German units that pushed the British back through Belgium and France. The story of Dunkirk is often called a miracle, and in many ways, it was. But it was also a story of shame, of chaos, of heartbreak, and of choices that haunt the men who made them to this day. It is, above all, a story about what happens when ordinary people are caught in the machinery of war, and how some of them, against all odds, found a way out. On the 10th of May, 1940, Hitler's armies turned their attention to Western Europe. The Germans, using every means of attack at their disposal, had already crushed Poland, Norway, and Denmark. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast, brutal, and overwhelming. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry working in terrifying coordination, smashing through defenses before they could be organized, and racing ahead before anyone could react. It was a new kind of warfare, and the Allies were utterly unprepared for it. Now it was the turn of France, Belgium, and Holland to feel the full might of the German forces, led by the fearsome Panzer divisions and supported from the air by the Luftwaffe. On the very same day that the German offensive began, Winston Churchill succeeded Neville Chamberlain as British Prime Minister. Churchill and his new coalition government were immediately faced with an unhappy and serious state of affairs. 28 German divisions were sweeping through the Low Countries toward France and the northern coast. The speed of the advance was staggering. The Germans were attacking on three fronts. Holland surrendered on the 14th of May, while Army Group B struck Belgium, and believing this to be the main German thrust, 10 divisions of what was called the British Expeditionary Force, along with the French 1st and 7th Armies, were sent north to meet them. They received a tremendous reception from the Belgians, cheering crowds everywhere. Bob Pendleton's unit was on exercise near the Somme when the invasion began. On hearing the news, they immediately moved forward into Belgium. "We got a tremendous reception from the Belgians," he recalled, cheering crowds everywhere. "We were amazed that the Germans made no effort to try and stop us." He paused, because, of course, they were thinking that we should go up there. It was a trap, and the British walked straight into it. While the BEF and the best French forces were drawn north into Belgium, the real German hammer blow was falling far to the south. The Allied forces soon realized that to the south, the Germans were also thundering through France. The French had always assumed that the Ardennes, the thick, forested hills along the Belgian-Luxembourg border, were impenetrable for tanks, and so their reserve army was stationed there. It broke rapidly under the blitzkrieg. The assumption that had underpinned the entire Allied defensive strategy was, in the space of days, proven fatally wrong. Georg Lehrmann and his regiment were part of that unstoppable advance. "We marched over Belgium," he recalled, "the Albert Canal, to the English Channel. The Albert Canal had been taken by a parachute unit jumping out from gliders, so we were able to march through without a problem." For the German soldiers, those early days must have felt like the war was already won. Bob Pendleton's unit moved up to the River Dyle, the first natural obstacle in front of the advancing Germans. There, they demolished bridges in the hope of slowing the onslaught, but the Allied armies were unable to halt the rapid German advance. By the 21st of May, the French and British forces had been completely separated, split in two by the speed and effectiveness of blitzkrieg. The situation was deteriorating by the hour. "We were told, to our amazement and bewilderment, that we were going to withdraw," Bob recalled. The French had apparently given way on our right flank. The Germans had broken through at Sedan and the Ardennes, and were racing towards the Channel ports. Our right flank was exposed. He took a breath, so off we set backwards. And that was the start of the withdrawal, which was to last a fortnight and take us to the beaches of Dunkirk. There was now the very real likelihood of a Belgian surrender, and the British were faced with the terrifying prospect of losing their access to the Channel ports, the lifeline of the British forces. Supplies were running low. There was little to be done. The commander of the British Expeditionary Force, General Lord Gort, requested that the War Office make plans to evacuate his army from France. Gort selected Dunkirk as the place from which to rescue the British forces. The task of organizing the evacuation in Britain was given to Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the commander at Dover. It was codenamed Operation Dynamo. With that decision, the fate of an army, and perhaps of the war itself, would come down to a stretch of beach and whatever ships could be found to cross the Channel. But the men being asked to fight their way to that beach were in no shape for a grand campaign. Bob Pendleton's own experience told the story of Britain's unpreparedness in miniature. "When I came over here originally," he said, shaking his head at the memory, "I was issued with 12 bullets. 12. 4.5 bullets. I didn't have a gun, just the 12 bullets, and a motorcycle." He let that sink in. One Bren gun in a battalion, with nothing, and they were supposed to fight the Germans. Just impossible. This was the reality behind the official dispatches and the War Office communiques. An army sent to fight one of the most formidable military machines in history, equipped with almost nothing. The men knew it. Their officers knew it. And now, with the order to retreat, the only question was whether they could reach the coast before the Germans caught them. Ordered to retreat, the British troops began to fall back toward the coast. And as the soldiers withdrew, they found themselves sharing the roads with something that made the horror of war impossible to ignore: the refugees. Bob Pendleton had just met a girl called Simone in the Belgian town of Les Cans when the orders came through. The last time he saw her, she was with her mother and father, her father pulling a cart loaded with their belongings, joining the millions of civilians streaming away from the German advance. "I'll never forget that day," Bob said, his voice heavy even after 6 decades. "I thought afterwards, many times, that if I'd had my wits about me, she could have got dressed in soldier's clothes, and I could have taken her on the bike and got her across to England. But anyway, that's how it happened." It was a small, personal tragedy amid the vastness of the catastrophe. But it captures something essential about what Dunkirk meant to the people who lived through it, the haunting sense of what was lost, and the choices that could never be undone. The withdrawal itself was a nightmare. Night after night, the same grim routine. "We would withdraw during the night," Bob explained, "about an hour after everybody else had already left. So it was a very lonely business, waiting for an hour to elapse before you went withdrawing yourself, and then withdrawing through the darkness, terrified of losing your way. Arriving at a new position behind another river, digging in the early hours of the morning, and during part of the day, waiting for a German onslaught, and then doing exactly the same the following night. Every foot, every yard of ground was contested. The casualties among soldiers and civilians alike began to mount. The Stukas, the German dive bombers with their terrifying wailing sirens, came again and again, and their targets were not only soldiers. There was a great deal of bombing at this time, Bob recalled. Stuka dive bombing, but principally on the roads, against the refugees, which was a horrible sight. The bombs would come down, and they would run in all directions, and very often they would get hit, so that you would have women and children lying dead in the roadway, amidst all their belongings, over the very road which you had got to drive your trucks. And so you did your best to avoid running over everything, but it was just constant, all the way back to Dunkirk. The convoys were hit too, horses and men killed together in the same blasts, and all along the line of retreat, the evidence of an army in desperate flight. Georg Lehrmann saw it from the other side. The lorries, the guns, they weren't just left standing, he said. They had been tipped over, and from that you could tell that the men who had used them had needed to get away quickly. They'd been driven into ditches and tipped over. For one British soldier, the chaos of the retreat brought a moment he would never forget. He came upon a house full of wounded men, with a single soldier at the door. "Is there anything you can do for me?" the soldier asked. "I've got all these men in here. They're all wounded. I have no means of getting them away. I just don't know what to do about them." There was nothing to be done. It was not a nice feeling, the soldier admitted. Meanwhile, General Lord Gort withdrew the British forces to a final defensive position along the canal line of the rivers Yser, Scarpe, and Aue. He had hoped that help would come from the towns of Boulogne and Calais, but Boulogne fell into German hands on the 24th of May, and Calais, despite an epic defensive action by the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, was captured 2 days later. The position looked hopeless. Every channel port south of Dunkirk was now in enemy hands. There was one way out, and one way only. We didn't know what was going on, Bob admitted. I suspect that nobody did. And we were a bit scared of these Stukas that kept dropping the odd bomb here and there. But nevertheless, this disillusionment and fear, I don't think, in any way prevented us from carrying out our normal soldierly duties. Not all the encounters on the retreat were with the enemy. At one point, Bob came across 6 French soldiers, their rifles in hand. They stopped him. "Anglais party, they said the English are leaving." Bob protested. "No, we're here," but the Frenchmen were insistent. "Party, Dunkirk," they said. Bob was baffled. "I'd never even heard of Dunkirk," he recalled. "That was the first I knew about the evacuation. This would have been about 10 days before we got there. 10 days. 10 days of fighting, retreating, and marching toward a destination that most of the men on the ground didn't even know existed as a plan. 2 of Bob's comrades had stayed behind to blow up an obstacle, and as the charges went off, they could hear German troops marching down the road toward them. The 2 men hid in a ditch and covered themselves while the German soldiers marched past close enough to touch, close enough to hear the rhythm of their boots on the cobblestones. And then something remarkable happened, something that, even now, historians struggle to fully explain. This was a critical point in the evacuation. The unrelenting German attacks could have destroyed the Allied forces caught in northern France. The British had a powerful, seemingly unstoppable enemy in front of them, and the North Sea at their back. In Britain, there were dark predictions that perhaps only 50,000 men from the entire army could be saved. With more than 4 times that number of British troops in France, it did not look good. But Hitler made a key decision that helped the Allies in their retreat to Dunkirk. Because he needed to conquer the rest of France, Hitler wanted to rest his armies. On the 24th of May, he ordered a temporary halt to the Fourth Army's advance. They were to take 2 days to rest and resupply. It was a decision that has been debated ever since, and it gave the Allies a crucial breathing space. There was another factor behind the halt. Hermann Goering had assured the Führer that his Luftwaffe could destroy the Allied troops in the Dunkirk pocket on their own, from the air alone. It was a boast that would prove hollow, but at the time, Hitler believed it. Georg Lehrmann's regiment had been part of the relentless advance. "First of all, we saw the Stukas and the explosions from our artillery," he recalled. "But it didn't last long. It lasted about 2 hours. And then we had to stop firing, and I was given the order to drive into France. The halt had come, and with it, the slenderest of chances for the men in the pocket. Georg Lehrmann witnessed firsthand what the halt looked like from the German side. With the lull in fighting, the thoughts of some soldiers turned to darker impulses. In a town near the front, the consequences of indiscipline were made brutally clear. "We had a break for 4 hours one night," Georg recalled, "and in the morning we had to line up. One of our soldiers had forcibly raped a girl at gunpoint. We all gathered together at the town hall marketplace, and he was executed the same day. A measure to ensure that all soldiers knew what was going on, that during the war, such acts would be punished by death." During the unexpected respite, there were other crucial developments that helped the Allied cause. Captured German orders revealed a plan to attack in an area between Ypres and Menin, and General Gort was able to send reinforcements, thwarting a breakthrough that could have spelled disaster for the entire evacuation. And back in Britain, experts began to unlock the secrets of the captured Enigma coding machine, meaning that as the Germans rested, Gort was able to receive their decrypted messages. All of this helped ease some of the pressure on the Allies. But the men on the ground knew nothing of Enigma, nothing of high strategy, nothing of Hitler's hesitation. They only knew exhaustion. They knew the sound of Stukas. They knew the smell of burning oil and the taste of dust in their mouths. And they knew that every mile they marched brought them closer to either salvation or capture. "We were beginning to get really very tired," Bob said. "At the age of 18, 19, 20, you haven't got the stamina that you get later. And very difficult to keep awake." He recalled one night during the withdrawal when the entire column ground to a halt. He climbed out of his truck and walked forward to find his platoon sergeant and driver fast asleep in the cab. The war could wait, their bodies could not. By the time hostilities were fully resumed on the 27th of May, the Allied defensive positions around Dunkirk had been organized, and the first troops had already begun to sail for home. It was not before time. On that same day, Belgium formally surrendered. The ring was closing. Inside the defensive ring was a mass of seething humanity. 360,000 British, French, and Belgian troops, alongside more than 250,000 civilians, were packed into an area totaling less than 100 square miles. Military transports, trucks, tanks, and lorries lined the lanes and streets in their thousands. The air smelled of cordite and burning fuel. The constant crump of artillery merged with the scream of dive bombers overhead into a continuous wall of noise that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Bob Pendleton would never forget his first sight of it. It was like a vehicle scrapyard, he said. There were disabled vehicles lying on either side of the road, with barely room for people to get through. And it must be borne in mind that all this time, and with all this movement, we were hampered by the refugee columns streaming away from the Germans. Georg Lehrmann and his comrades saw the same chaos from the advancing German side. We saw the Stukas fly in, he recalled, and that the men had left everything lying around. We saw all the vehicles and the trains. Everything had been abandoned, so the men must have run away. We saw it all. The officers, he said, probably knew as little as the ordinary soldiers. But we were sent in. We were told we had to prevent the English departure. With the pocket gradually being reduced by German pressure, Bob was given a dangerous mission. He was ordered to go to Barges, a town 10 miles from Dunkirk, to deliver a message telling the troops there to fall back. I came in over the bridge, over the grass verge, parked the bike, Bob recalled, his eyes distant with the memory. Looked around. Everything was on fire. It was devastating. Absolute chaos. Nothing moving. The whole town blazing. I had to get towels wrapped around my head. I used the canal to dampen the towels and wrap them around so I wasn't affected by it. I had to walk from the motorcycle to the town hall, get down to the cellars, get these men out, inform them that they had to get to Dunkirk the only way they could walking. And yet, even with the Allies in such disarray, the Germans seemed somehow to hold back. Why they didn't attack all parts of the Allied defenses more vigorously is a mystery that has endured for more than 6 decades. There is even one outlandish theory that to secure a swift peace agreement with the British, Hitler deliberately allowed them to make their dramatic escape. Whether that theory holds water or not, the fact remains. The Germans made rapid inroads to the south, but strangely, in the center and to the north, they hardly advanced at all. As the men moved toward Dunkirk, they navigated by 2 things. We knew where it was for 2 reasons, one soldier recalled. We could see the pall of smoke emanating from the burning oil refinery. And also, quite honestly, you could just follow the Stukas all the way to Dunkirk, follow the bombers to safety. There was a grim logic to it. I felt they were about 8 or 9 miles away, Bob said. I thought they'd just come through and capture us and take us, because we had nothing to defend ourselves with. It was just a matter of waiting for them to appear. He paused, and the silence of the memory settled over him. But they never appeared. To this day, I cannot explain it. We had nothing, no guns, no ammunition, no hope of reinforcement. They could have walked through us like a knife through butter, but they never came. Not everyone was so fortunate. One of my best friends, who I joined the army with, got killed holding the bridgehead while we evacuated, Bob said quietly. So not everyone got away from Dunkirk. From the 26th of May, the great rescue of the Allied forces at Dunkirk began. While British and French troops fought to defend the town itself, a remarkable fleet of ships had arrived off the French coast to ferry the besieged troops back to Britain. The British Admiralty had realized early on that to evacuate more than 200,000 troops from Dunkirk, it would need a far larger fleet than was currently available. And so a desperate appeal went out to all owners of small boats to come to the aid of the Royal Navy. This flotilla of little ships made Dunkirk the stuff of legend. Every conceivable type of sailing craft, yachts, fishing boats, pleasure boats, steam packets, and barges turned up on the south coast or in the Thames estuary to help with the evacuation. The fleet included more than 40 British, French, Belgian, and Dutch warships of all types, destroyers, minesweepers, sloops, personnel ships, all come to aid their allies in their desperate hour of need. And of course, there were the famous little ships, more than 900 of them, in all shapes and sizes. But for the little ships, this was certainly no pleasure cruise. From the skies above came the German dive bombers and machine gun fire. From the shore came the shells of the German artillery. Georg Lehrmann was in one of those artillery regiments, and he had been ordered to prevent the Allied evacuation. What he saw, what he was ordered to do, haunts him still. "I'll be honest," Georg said, and his voice cracked even after all those years. "I cried when they said that we should fire into the men. You can't do that. They had no weapons, nothing at all, and we were able to fire with artillery. We had rifles. The infantry was there as well. They had no means of defense. They had thrown away their weapons. They weren't running around defending themselves. They were on the beach, trying to reach the boats." Those words carry a weight that no military history can quite convey. A young German soldier, weeping at the orders he had been given, firing on men who could not fire back. It is one of the most honest and devastating testimonies to come out of Dunkirk from either side. The whole episode, Georg would say later, filled him even today with great shame. "I hate it," he said simply. "This place was absolutely full of bodies, men lying about, some walking into the sea. Our guns were trained on the fleeing people who couldn't defend themselves anymore, and we fired on them like crazy." He paused, searching for words. "I've no idea why. And what of the men on the receiving end of that fire? What was it like to stand on a beach with no weapon, no cover, and no certainty that you would ever leave?" Remarkably, the veterans recall not panic, but a strange numbness. "We didn't see panic," one soldier said. "Panic didn't exist. Everybody was too frightened to panic, I think. Too frightened to panic." It is a phrase that captures the peculiar psychology of extreme danger, the point at which fear becomes so total that it circles back around to a kind of frozen calm. On the beaches, the scene was barely controlled chaos. "You came eventually in sight of the sea," Bob recalled, "and there was this great pall of smoke to our left, which was Dunkirk, the oil tanks blazing. And then in front, there were great lines of soldiers, up to their waists, their necks, stretching into the sea. There were queues and queues of men waiting to embark. The area was being bombed constantly." Bob and his companions moved about 500 yards down the beach, dug into the sand dunes, and waited. "The first thing we all wanted was some sleep," he said. "So we got into the sand dunes and we went to sleep. And people often say to me, how awful the dive bombing must have been. We slept through it. I think we must have slept for about 24 hours. We were so tired. 24 hours, asleep on a beach under German bombardment. That single detail tells you more about the state of those men than any casualty report ever could. The footage that survives from those days, and the photographs taken by those who were there, show scenes that are at once chaotic and eerily orderly. Long lines of men standing in the surf, waiting their turn. Boats capsized in the shallows, columns of black smoke rising from the burning port behind them, and everywhere, the detritus of an army in retreat, rifles stacked on the sand, helmets floating in the waves, vehicles driven into the sea as makeshift jetties. Meanwhile, Georg watched from the dunes on the German side. "We stood up here and watched the men trying to get away in the boats," he said, "and it was difficult. They couldn't land properly. They had to go into the water and then into the boats, and that took time. The Stukas arrived in waves. The same ones flew over repeatedly," Georg recalled. "All we heard was the wailing siren. It dived and boomed. For the men on the beach with no cover and no weapons, each attack was an exercise in pure terror. And yet there were also moments of dark, absurd comedy amid the carnage." One soldier waiting on the beach remembered the scene. "I remember coming across a French soldier who had obviously just been in a bombing raid. He had one eyeball hanging down his cheek, and he was screaming for help, and I was not much good at coping with a situation like that. Even those who made it onto the ships were not safe. Some soldiers who thought they had reached safety soon found it was a case of out of the frying pan, into the fire. A couple of destroyers came ashore," one veteran recalled, "and we joined the queue of men embarking. However, we chose the wrong one. Hardly had we set sail when it was hit, a direct hit from an aircraft. The entire forecastle was blown out. We were fortunately on the deck, and many men were wounded. However, another destroyer, HMS Malcolm, came alongside, and we were able to throw the wounded across. Eventually, we scrambled across ourselves, and we set sail. The most successful day of the evacuation was the 30th of May, when 53,000 men were ferried back to Britain. Many small ships made the journey across the channel several times, back and forth through the bombardment. The sailors of those privately owned volunteer craft put their lives on the line. By the time the evacuation officially ended on the 4th of June, Nearly 250 of the small craft had been destroyed, almost a third of those that had taken part. The human cost was written in the faces of the men who waited, faces blackened with smoke and oil, eyes hollow with exhaustion, uniforms soaked through from hours standing in the surf. Georg saw what was happening and felt something unexpected, not triumph, but futility. All they wanted was to get away, he said. Get away from the beaches and get over to England. That was the main thing. There were so many men. It was just impossible to move without them, loads of them, all over the place. And then, with the quiet honesty that defined his testimony, everyone realized that it was senseless. The men at the guns didn't see it, but the infantrymen they stopped, and I noticed that less and less guns were firing. In the midst of this desperate evacuation, the troops maintained an almost superhuman discipline, even though for some it was 3 days before they were able to leave the shore. One officer recalled meeting the adjutant of his battalion on the beach. "Good to see you," the adjutant said. "Right. Get your platoon off. Back to England now." The officer asked the obvious question, "How do I do that?" The adjutant's reply was magnificently unhelpful. "Use your initiative." But before Bob Pendleton could leave the Dunkirk beaches, his brigadier gave him one last message to deliver, this time to the British troops still holding the defensive line. It was time for them to leave and get to the beaches. Bob rode his motorcycle up to a farm where the troops were supposed to be. There was no sign of anyone except the farmer and his family. He went back and reported, "They're not there," he told the brigadier. The reply came, "Well, they must have retired. Try again." So Bob went back. He turned right at the junction, and there, 50 yards away, was the advance guard of the German SS, machine guns, armored cars, everything. "I didn't take any more to do," Bob said. "I turned that bike down very, very quickly and made sure they weren't following me." He got back to the brigadier. "Well, I know they're not there now," he reported. "Why?" "Because the Germans are there." The brigadier nodded. "We can now go to Dunkirk." And then there is the story of the Padre, one of those moments that, even amid the horror, reminds you that war is also a profoundly human experience, full of absurdity and dark comedy. A group of soldiers had set off in a small boat, rowing toward a destroyer they could see silhouetted against the night sky. They were about 400 yards away when they heard the anchor chain coming up. The destroyer was turning. It was leaving without them. A padre who was sitting in the middle of the boat leaped to his feet, flung his arms wide to the heavens and shouted, "Lord, Lord, why hast thou forsaken us?" And 40 soldiers as one voice shouted, "Sit down," because as he leaped to his feet, the boat rocked violently. Water came sloshing over the sides, and that great shout echoed across the water to the destroyer. It came to a stop. Whether it was God or 40 angry soldiers, something had been heard. By nightfall on the 1st of June, real and spectacular progress had been made. Only 3 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force remained ashore. By the following day, they had all been evacuated. The defenses around the town were being manned only by French troops, who fought doggedly on against the great tide of the German army. It was only a matter of time before they were engulfed completely. Their sacrifice, holding the line while the last British soldiers were taken off, deserves to be remembered alongside the little ships and the beaches. Without the French rearguard, thousands more men would have been lost. On the 3rd and 4th of June, British ships returned to rescue as many as possible. Bob Pendleton was among the very last to leave. His escape was worthy of a film. The pier had been blown apart, a 10-foot gap where the structure had been destroyed. Soldiers had bridged it with planks they had found. Bob rode his motorcycle across the makeshift bridge, then let the bike go into the sea. "I tried to climb down the pier," he said. "These broad beams, very slippery. I did about 5 trips on a motorcycle, and then I slipped about halfway down and I fell. And the fishermen caught me into the boat." He paused. "And that's how we got away." Some French fishing trawlers were the only vessels that could still get in the pier. It was full of blazing ships. It was chaos to the very end. Inevitably, Dunkirk fell, and the final troops were evacuated on the 4th of June. Even so, some 40,000 Frenchmen were left behind, men who had fought bravely to hold the perimeter, who had expected to be evacuated alongside their British allies, and who now faced years of captivity. Their abandonment would poison Anglo-French relations for years to come. But Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, had been a success beyond anyone's darkest expectations in late May. The initial prediction had been that perhaps 50,000 men could be saved. In the end, it was incredible that 338,226 Allied troops had been borne to safety across the Channel. 139,000 of these were French and Belgian soldiers. It was, by any measure, an astonishing achievement, a logistical miracle conjured from chaos by the courage of ordinary sailors and the stubbornness of soldiers who refused to die. The men came home to England, and the first thing many of them remember is not the relief, not the joy, but a cup of tea and a jam sandwich. "We felt thoroughly demoralized and awful," one soldier admitted. "We'd run away. Our fathers had fought for 4 long years in France and had never given way, and we'd been in action for a fortnight. We had hardly seen any real fighting. The shame was real, and it was deep." These men knew the truth of what had happened, even as the newspapers were calling it a miracle. And then came the speech that changed how many of them felt. The men were marched to a gymnasium and told to sit on the floor. There was a gallery overlooking them, and out onto it strode a full colonel with a red cap. "Welcome home. Heroes of the BEF," he declared. And the men thought, heroes? They looked at each other, dirty, thin, ashamed, and the words seemed to belong to a different army entirely. But the colonel went on, at some length, about what a wonderful show they had put up against overwhelming odds. He spoke of courage and duty and sacrifice, and by the end of it, the veteran recalled, "We really felt very much better, so that, in fact, when we eventually got home on leave, we were greeted everywhere as heroes." He paused, but I knew, in my heart of hearts, we weren't heroes at all. No matter how the returning troops felt, there was understandable joy and relief throughout Great Britain that so many had escaped. But harsh reality soon tempered the euphoria. The country was now at the mercy of the Germans. Although Britain's army had been delivered virtually intact, almost all of its equipment was still in France, in the hands of the enemy. The numbers were devastating. All tanks and transport had been lost. 2,500 guns, 70,000 vehicles, 500,000 tons of ammunition, all of it left in the wreckage of Dunkirk. If the Germans had launched an invasion of Britain in those weeks, the island would have had almost nothing with which to defend itself. The soldiers were home, but the tools of war were scattered across the fields and roads of northern France. Dunkirk had been a victory to boost morale, but little else. The saga also did little for Anglo-French relations. The Vichy government that was soon established in France coined the phrase perfidious Albion, accusing Britain of abandoning its allies in an all-out attempt to save its own army. Many think this an unfounded slur that denigrated the heroic efforts of the evacuation fleet and insulted the memory of those who had given their lives. Winston Churchill attempted to calm Britain's euphoric mood. "Wars are not won by evacuations," warned the new Prime Minister, as he tried to prepare the country for the dark days ahead. He was right, of course. The months that followed would bring the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, and the long, grinding years of a war that was far from over. But Churchill also understood something else, that Dunkirk had given the nation something it desperately needed. Not a victory, but a story. A story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. A story of survival against the odds. A story that, true or not in all its details, would sustain a country through its darkest hours. For the men who had been there, the story was more complicated. They knew the chaos, the fear, the shame of retreat. They knew about the friends who didn't make it back. They knew about the 40,000 Frenchmen left behind. They knew that Dunkirk was not a victory, it was the narrowest of escapes from total catastrophe. But they also knew something else. They knew what it felt like to be standing on a beach at the edge of the world, with nothing between them and oblivion but a stretch of gray water and the courage of the men who sailed across it to bring them home. The events at Dunkirk were truly extraordinary, and those who lived through them have never forgotten. "Frightening but uplifting," one veteran said. "Uplifting because of the spirit of the people on the beaches," another recalled. Everyone talked about the miracle of Dunkirk, and it seemed to be a miracle that so many of us got off. It was a miracle the water was so calm that the weather was good, and that the Germans didn't try to launch their final killer blow, which they could have done so easily. Georg Lehrmann, standing on the beaches where he once fired on defenseless men, spoke carefully. "This is the first time I've been back," he said. "And for me there are, of course, good and bad memories. I look at it like this. The war was not necessary. We didn't know why the war took place." Bob Pendleton, walking beside the man who had once been his enemy, reflected on what Dunkirk had meant. "I looked on it as though we'd been defeated in France," he said, "which we were. And then afterwards, as the war went on, You realized that you were going to win eventually. That was a great feeling. The war went on, of course. After Dunkirk came the battles that shaped the future of the world. Normandy, El Alamein, Monte Cassino, the Ardennes. Men who had been implacable enemies would one day meet at the scenes of those epic struggles. But Dunkirk was where it began for the British, at least. It was their first great test, and they had failed it in every military sense. And yet from that failure had come something extraordinary, a story of rescue and resilience that became the foundation of everything that followed. Two old men on a beach, one English, one German. More than 60 years since they stood on opposite sides of a catastrophe, walking together now, in the quiet of a French afternoon, sharing memories that most people can barely imagine. 338,226 men were saved at Dunkirk. But Dunkirk was never just about the numbers. It was about the men who queued in the water for hours, under fire, waiting for boats that might never come. It was about the sailors who crossed and recrossed the channel through bombs and shells. It was about a German artilleryman who wept at the orders he was given. It was about a signalman who lost a girl called Simone and never forgot her. It was about soldiers who slept for 24 hours under dive bombers because their bodies simply gave out. It was about a padre who stood up in a boat and nearly capsized it, and 40 men who shouted him down, and a destroyer that stopped. It was about a motorcycle ridden across a broken pier and dropped into the sea. It was about a jam sandwich at Ramsgate that tasted like the finest meal a man had ever eaten. Dunkirk was a defeat. It was a miracle. It was a disgrace. It was a triumph. It was all of these things at once, and it was the moment when Britain looked total disaster in the face and somehow, improbably, impossibly, got away. The men who lived through it carried the memory for the rest of their lives, not as heroes, not as victims, but as witnesses to something that should never have happened and as proof that even in the darkest hour, the human will to survive can find a way. Because that is the truth of Dunkirk. It was not glorious, it was not clean, but it was real. And in its desperate, chaotic, heartbreaking reality, it became something that no one had planned, and no one expected, a story that an entire nation would cling to in the years of darkness that followed. A story of a signalman on a motorcycle, riding through burning towns to deliver messages that might already be too late. A story of a German artilleryman who wept at his own orders. A story of fishermen and yachtsmen who sailed into hell and brought an army home. And perhaps that is the real miracle. Not that the army was saved, but that in the saving of it, something else was preserved, something harder to define, but just as vital. A belief that even when everything has gone wrong, when the enemy is at the gates and the sea is at your back, there is still a reason to keep going. There is still a reason to hope. The beaches of Dunkirk are quiet now. The tide comes in and goes out, as it always has. The sand that once ran red has been washed clean a million times over. The piers have been rebuilt, the buildings restored, the scars of war smoothed away by time and the patient work of reconstruction. Tourists come in summer. Children build sandcastles. It is a place of peace. But if you listen carefully, in the wind off the channel, you can almost hear them, the voices of the men who were here. The shouts, the prayers, the silence after the guns, the roar of engines and the crash of waves against the hulls of small boats, the crackle of burning oil and the distant thud of artillery. They echo still, because some places remember, even when the world forgets. And Dunkirk, this quiet, ordinary beach town on the northern coast of France, will remember forever. Although Britain was at war, there was very little sign of it in the fields and lanes of Kent, Surrey, and Sussex during those early days of August 1940. The hedgerows were thick with summer green, the orchards were heavy with fruit, and the long, golden afternoons stretched on as though the world beyond the English Channel were someone else's problem entirely. Farmers tended their crops. The war, for all its dread, still felt like something happening far away, but that illusion was about to be shattered. On the morning of Thursday, August the 8th, a decisive new phase began in what history would come to call the Battle of Britain. During the previous weeks, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been concentrating its efforts on British shipping in the English Channel, launching sorties against the south and east coasts. These had been probing attacks, testing Britain's defenses, measuring the response. But from the 8th of August, those attacks took on a terrifying new intensity. During the previous night, a convoy of slow-moving merchant ships, escorted by Royal Navy destroyers, had started its passage through the Channel. They were carrying food and munitions, the lifeblood of a nation under siege. But the convoy had been detected by the Germans, and early the next morning, waves of Stuka dive bombers, escorted by fighters, swooped down on the ships. The screaming of the Stukas' sirens, those mechanical banshee wails designed to terrorize anyone below, filled the air as bombs tore into the water and the hulls of the merchant vessels. 7 squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires scrambled to meet them. In the fierce dogfights that followed, 31 German planes were brought down, for the loss of 19 of our own. 7 ships were sunk, and many more damaged. It was a brutal exchange, and it was to become the pattern of attack in the Channel during the following days, wave after wave of German aircraft, met by the desperate courage of a handful of British fighter pilots. But to understand how Britain found itself in this position alone, outnumbered, with its back against the sea, we need to go back a few months. Back to the decisions, the miscalculations, and the hubris that set the stage for what was about to unfold. Meantime, in Berlin, plans for the invasion of Britain were being pursued with cold, methodical precision. Hitler had hoped that with the fall of France, an isolated Britain might be glad to make a peace pact with him. France had capitulated in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been driven from the continent at Dunkirk. Surely, Hitler reasoned, the British would see the futility of continuing alone. He was wrong. When Churchill bluntly declined the offer, Hitler decided to invade at the earliest opportunity. And so the machinery of Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's strategy for the invasion and occupation of Britain, was set into motion. The plan was methodical and terrifying in its ambition. Phase 1 was to knock out the Royal Air Force. With the RAF destroyed, Germany would have complete control of the air and sea lanes across the Channel. Phase 2 would begin with the destruction of Britain's coastline defenses. The Luftwaffe would then drop massive detachments of parachute troops to seize airfields and establish beachheads. And Phase 3, the actual invasion, would see Panzer divisions crossing in high-speed barges under a protective umbrella of Luftwaffe fighters. Spearheads of landed troops would thrust into England to divide, surround, and destroy all opposition. On paper, it looked unstoppable, and in truth, there seemed to be very little opposition in the whole of Britain to stop it. The numbers were stark and sobering. There was not enough equipment left in the entire country for a single modern division. Just 1 tank for every 1,000 square miles of territory. Just 1 machine gun for each mile of beach. The British Navy, formidable as it was scattered all over the globe, guarding vital food and supply routes from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in any case, it would have been suicide to use the fleet in the narrow waters of the Channel, with German aircraft flying overhead, dropping bombs and torpedoes on anything that moved. And then there was the Royal Air Force, Britain's last line of defense. But it was outnumbered by the enemy 10-1, both in trained men and machines, 10-1. Those were the odds facing every young pilot who climbed into a Spitfire or a Hurricane in the summer of 1940. There were the British people themselves. How would they react in the event of invasion? From the fall of France onwards, they had no doubt that there would be an attempt at invasion, and that it might come at any moment. They knew that every man, woman, and child in the country would be a target, so they knew they had a big job to do. For the civilian population, home front defense was the name of the game to be ready for the onslaught whenever Hitler decided to unleash it. And back in Berlin, that was exactly what Hitler and his generals were discussing. The final touches were being put to the plans of Operation Sea Lion. The time had come for Phase 1 to begin. The mathematics of invasion seemed overwhelmingly in Germany's favor. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, overrun Denmark and Norway, swept through the Low Countries, and brought France, mighty France, with the largest army in Europe to its knees in just 6 weeks. Every army that had stood in Hitler's path had been crushed. Every fortress had fallen. Every defense line had been breached. Now, only 21 miles of gray, churning water stood between the most powerful military machine in history and the last free nation in Western Europe. For the men of Fighter Command, the stakes could not have been higher. They were not fighting for territory or resources or political advantage. They were fighting for survival, the survival of their country, their families, and everything they held dear. If they failed, there would be no second chance. There would be no strategic withdrawal to fight another day. There would be only conquest, occupation, and the swastika flying over Buckingham Palace. That was the reality they faced every morning when they climbed into their cockpits, and that was the reality that drove them to fight with a ferocity and determination that Göring's pilots had never encountered before. Göring sent in hundreds of aircraft of all types, bombers, fighters, dive bombers across that 21-mile stretch of channel, a mere 8 short minutes of flying time. That was all that separated the airfields of northern France from the shores of southern England. 8 minutes between safety and annihilation. The first tactics were to bomb the convoys carrying food and munitions from overseas, bound for the ports of Bristol, Southampton, and London. German planes had already been carrying out scattered raids during July, but this was the first full concentrated attack, August the 8th. The next phase of the Battle of Britain had begun in earnest. Göring had promised the Luftwaffe that it would face little opposition from the RAF and would be able to knock it quickly out of the sky. He told his pilots they would have air superiority within days, perhaps weeks at most. However, there was a problem that Göring, in his arrogance, had failed to recognize. The Royal Air Force of August 1940 was quite a different creature from the poorly equipped outfit, which Hitler had known it to be at the time of Munich, 2 years before. In those 2 years, Britain had been quietly, desperately building. New factories had been erected, new aircraft had been designed and produced, and a generation of young men had been trained to fly them. The days of August 1940 were absolutely critical for both Britain and Germany, if not, in fact, for the future of the free world. The skies over southern England were a daily battleground of fighter aircraft. It was a time of war, perhaps the last, when battles were being waged on almost a personal basis by scarcely a handful of men, rather than by armies of nameless troops. They could see the whites of each other's eyes. They could watch a man they had just shot spinning down in flames, and they climbed back into their cockpits and did it again and again and again. These young men, many of them barely out of their teens, kept the vastly superior Nazi forces at bay. They gave Britain the breathing space it so desperately needed to bring its defenses up to scratch. Meantime, the German bombers continued pounding the coast from the Thames through Kent and Sussex to Weymouth and beyond. The battles themselves were terrifyingly brief and impossibly violent. A dogfight that felt like an eternity to the pilots involved might last only minutes. They fought at speeds of over 300 miles per hour, pulling turns so tight that the blood drained from their heads and their vision narrowed to a gray tunnel. They fired their guns in short, savage bursts, knowing they had only 15 seconds of ammunition. A single well-aimed burst could send an opponent spiraling to earth in flames. A single moment of inattention could mean death. There was no margin for error, no room for hesitation, and precious little time for fear. And when they landed, if they landed, they taxied to their dispersal points, climbed out of their cockpits on legs that trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline, drank a mug of tea, and waited for the bell that would send them up again. Some of them flew so many sorties in a single day that they lost count. Some of them were so tired they could not remember the details of the fights they had just survived. In just the first 10 days of this phase of the Battle of Britain, the Germans launched no fewer than 26 major attacks. During that time, their aircraft losses totaled 4 times as many as ours. It was a ratio that defied every calculation the German High Command had made. For every British plane lost, 4 German aircraft were destroyed. And there was another factor working in Britain's favor. As many as 60 of the British pilots who bailed out over English soil were successfully rescued by the Air Sea Rescue Service. Most of the men picked up were trained and experienced pilots, fortunately able to fight again, unlike the German pilots Britain rescued, who became prisoners of war. Every German pilot shot down over England was a permanent loss. Every British pilot who survived was back in the cockpit the next day. The Germans now turned their attention increasingly to port towns such as Southampton, Plymouth, and others, trying to immobilize the ports before the supplies from overseas could grow from a trickle to a flood. The docks were bombed relentlessly. Warehouses were set ablaze. Cranes were twisted into useless wreckage. Though the ports took a terrible onslaught, they couldn't be knocked out entirely, and vital cargoes continued to be unloaded with the protection of the RAF above. It seemed that attacking the Hurricanes and Spitfires in the air just wasn't working. So Göring decided to try a different approach. If he couldn't shoot them down in the sky, he would smash them on the ground. The Luftwaffe turned its attention to the airfields Hawking, Manston, Tangmere, Biggin Hill names that were to become household words to the citizens of Britain. Many planes were saved by quick thinking, parked in airfield corners close to trees and hedges, instead of being left out on the runways like sitting targets while awaiting the next sortie. The cost to the German attackers was high, and many trained pilots finished up as prisoners of war. But the airfields were being hit hard. Runways were cratered. Hangars were reduced to twisted metal. Communications were severed. It was a frustrating time for the Nazi leaders. On a 2,000-mile front from Norway to Normandy, their Blitz program was being stymied because the RAF was still flying. Against all odds, against all predictions, against every rational calculation, the RAF was still in the air. Hitler sent for Field Marshal Goering and ordered him to bring British resistance to a quick end. It was seriously holding up his plans for invasion before mid-September and the end of summer. The urgency was real. Hitler knew that a channel crossing would only be feasible in the calm waters of late summer. Once autumn arrived, the seas would become too rough for the flat-bottomed barges he planned to use. Every day the RAF survived was a day closer to the weather turning against him. Every week of delay narrowed the window until it would slam shut entirely. The clock was ticking, and for once, it was not ticking in Germany's favor. The losses, meanwhile, were mounting on both sides. Every morning, the tally boards at Fighter Command headquarters were updated: aircraft lost, pilots killed, pilots wounded, pilots missing. The numbers were grim, but they were grimmer still for the Luftwaffe. Goering's Air Force was bleeding pilots and aircraft at a rate it could not sustain indefinitely. The Channel, which was supposed to be merely a minor obstacle, had become a graveyard for German airmen. Those who bailed out over England were captured. Those who came down in the Channel often drowned before rescue could reach them. The attrition was relentless. Goering ordered all-out attacks not only on the airfields further inland, but on factories, machine shops, and anything supplying the aircraft industry. If he couldn't knock out the RAF in the air, he hoped to knock it out by starvation on the assembly line. No more Spitfires, no more Hurricanes, no more replacement engines, no more spare parts. Starve the beast, and eventually it would die. He adopted the tactic of using proportionally more fighters per bomber, so that the bombers were well protected for doing their destructive job. Escorted by their fighters all around them, above, below, on every flank, the German formations were able to break through the coastal defenses by sheer weight of numbers. They reached further inland than they had so far managed, bombing aerodromes, aircraft plants, munitions, factories, and machine shops. The damage was severe. Hangars burned. Factories were reduced to rubble. Workshops that had been producing vital components for Spitfires and Hurricanes were flattened overnight. For a few desperate weeks, it seemed as though Goering's new strategy might actually succeed. But the people's morale was at a remarkable level. Factories that were bombed on Monday were producing again by Wednesday. Workers cleared the rubble, rigged temporary shelters, and went back to their lathes and their assembly lines. The defense system was improving rapidly, too. Observation and listening posts were set up all along the coast, in addition to radar, that revolutionary new technology that could detect enemy aircraft before they even left the continent. The system worked with extraordinary efficiency. A quick flash from a control station to the nearest fighter station, and British pilots were on their way to greet the enemy before he reached the shores of Britain while still over the Channel. This ability to detect and intercept was something Goering had never anticipated, and it was costing him dearly. Day after day, aerial battles were fought out in the skies, 4 or 5 miles above the countryside of Kent and Sussex. Sometimes they were out of sight, and often out of sound of the spotters below. The pilots kept flying, barely snatching a couple of hours' rest before scrambling to another sortie. This sometimes continued for days on end. They flew until they could barely keep their eyes open, landed, drank a cup of tea, and flew again. The exhaustion was crushing. The losses were mounting. But they kept going. As far as the Nazi leaders were concerned, their plans for invasion were going nowhere fast. Already, Hitler had been forced to postpone the proposed date of Operation Sea Lion. The RAF simply would not die. And with every passing day, every failed raid, every bomber that didn't return to its French airfield, the window of opportunity for a channel crossing was growing narrower. The airfields of southern England had become the most contested ground on Earth. Biggin Hill alone was bombed repeatedly. On some days, the damage was so severe that operations had to be moved to emergency satellite fields. Craters scarred the runways, but the ground crews filled the holes, the engineers rigged new telephone lines, and the fighters kept taking off. The resilience was extraordinary. It was as if the very earth of England was refusing to yield. The pilots themselves were being pushed to the very limit of human endurance. Many of them were flying 5, 6, even 7 sorties a day. They grabbed sleep where they could in deck chairs beside the runway, in the cockpits of their aircraft, in any corner where they could close their eyes for 20 minutes before the bell rang again, and they were sprinting for their planes, and the losses among them were devastating. The average life expectancy of a fighter pilot during those weeks was measured not in months but in days. New pilots arrived from training schools, flew their first sortie, and were dead by tea time. The experienced pilots carried a burden that few could imagine: the knowledge that every friend they made might be gone tomorrow, and the certainty that their own turn could come at any moment. Yet they kept flying, they kept fighting, and slowly, imperceptibly, they were winning. The time had come to employ a different tactic entirely. From now on, the objective was plain and simple. It was to crush and devastate the spirit and morale of the British people, to make it impossible for them to continue the war against the Nazis any longer. If the RAF could not be destroyed in the air or on the ground, then perhaps the will of the people who supported it could be broken instead. It began on the afternoon of Saturday, September the 7th, 1940. 300 bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, darkened the sky over the Thames estuary. It was a formation so vast that it took 20 minutes to pass overhead. The target was not the airfields, not the radar stations, not the ports. The target was London itself. The switch from military targets to the capital city was, though no one knew it at the time, a strategic blunder of the highest order. It gave the battered airfields of Fighter Command a desperately needed respite. It gave the ground crews time to repair the runways and the communications links, and it gave the pilots a few precious hours of rest. But for the people of London, it marked the beginning of an ordeal that would test them to the very core of their being. For the Luftwaffe, there was no pretense of striking only military targets. The docks were hit, the factories were hit, but so were the homes, the schools, the hospitals, the churches. Entire streets were reduced to mountains of brick and broken timber. Families emerged from their shelters at dawn to find their homes gone, their neighborhoods unrecognizable, their neighbors dead or missing. Throughout the following week, Göring sent fleets of bombers to smash the spirit of the citizens, but without success. The spirit would not break. So Göring decided to throw in the full might of his Luftwaffe in one of the greatest air attacks ever mounted until that point in the war. It was a Sunday. The date, September the 15th, 1940, a day that would become one of the most famous dates in the Battle of Britain. It was an ideal summer day, clear skies, warm sunshine, when a fleet of 500 German bombers and fighters flew over the Channel and crossed the English coast, approaching from the southwest. Londoners taking a Sunday stroll in the parks, families sitting down to their roast dinners, children kicking footballs in the streets. They were largely unaware that an historic, three-dimensional battle was being fought to the death in the skies above them. It was aerial warfare on a scale never before seen. In the first half hour alone, 200 individual combats had taken place, 200 separate duels between pilots who could see each other through their canopies, who fired at each other from distances measured in yards, who watched each other fall. Some German planes pierced the London defenses. Some reached the sky above the city center itself. Bombs fell, buildings burned, people died. But the RAF was everywhere, and the toll on the German formations was devastating. What made this day different from all the others was not simply the scale of the attack, but the totality of the British response. Every available squadron was thrown into the fight. There were no reserves. Fighter Command had committed everything it had. If the Germans had known that, if they had known that one more wave of bombers might have found empty skies above London, the outcome might have been very different. But they did not know. All they knew was that everywhere they turned, there were Spitfires and Hurricanes diving out of the sun, raking their formations with machine gun fire, breaking up their bomber streams, sending aircraft tumbling earthward in spirals of smoke and flame. For the German pilots who survived that day and limped back to their airfields in northern France, the message was unmistakable. The RAF was not destroyed. It was not even close to being destroyed. The promises Göring had made, that British air power would be swept from the skies in a matter of days, had been exposed as fantasy. The Luftwaffe had thrown its best punch, and Britain had absorbed it and punched back harder. It wasn't until most people had returned home that evening and listened to their wireless sets that they learned about the most decisive air battle of the war. The first reports gave an overestimate of the German aircraft shot down the fog of war, inflated the numbers. It wasn't until much later that the figures were revised downward. Nevertheless, the reality was clear. It had been a mortal blow to the Luftwaffe and to Hitler's plans for invading Britain. On the 17th of September, just 2 days later, the invasion was postponed indefinitely. Operation Sea Lion, that grand plan to send Panzer divisions across the Channel, to drop paratroops on English soil, to march through London in triumph, it was over. Not cancelled, officially, just postponed. But everyone knew. September the 15th, 1940, the day the invasion died. But the end of the invasion threat did not mean the end of the bombing. Far from it. The Nazi military policy now shifted entirely to the destruction of the capital, mostly at night. The RAF couldn't be much help after dark. The technology for effective night fighting was still in its infancy. And so, when the sun went down, the defense of London rested on the efficiency of searchlights and the accuracy of anti-aircraft fire. The German bombers concentrated particularly on London's dockland, and left the East End districts a roaring inferno. The docks were a legitimate military target. Of course, the point through which much of Britain's imported food and war materials flowed. But the bombs didn't discriminate between a warehouse full of grain and a terraced house full of families. The fires spread. The devastation was indiscriminate. Night after night, the bombers came. The people of London learned to sleep underground, in the tube stations, on the platforms, wrapped in blankets, their children pressed close. They learned the sounds, the distant drone that grew louder, the crump of explosions walking closer. British bombers were taking the Blitz back into its country of origin. The RAF was striking at German cities, at factories, at military targets. It was a small force, nothing compared to what Bomber Command would eventually become. But it was a statement of defiance. Britain was not merely enduring, Britain was hitting back. The ambulance drivers who raced through streets filled with rubble and unexploded ordnance to reach the wounded. The underground stations of London became a world of their own during those long nights. Entire communities formed on the platforms. People claimed their regular spots. Children did their homework by candlelight. Elderly couples shared blankets and flasks of tea. But above all, there was a grim, shared determination to see it through. The station smelled of sweat and dust and damp wool, and the rumble of the trains had been replaced by the rumble of bombs. But they were safe down there. Hitler was furious. He proclaimed the RAF night gangsters, and for their crime, he vowed to exact on British cities a thousandfold revenge. The first target of this vengeful fury was to be the city of Coventry. On the night of the 14th of November, 1940, 1 million pounds of bombs were hurled on the city between dusk and the following dawn. Coventry was bombed flatter and more heavily than Rotterdam or Warsaw. The medieval cathedral, which had stood for 500 years, was reduced to a shell. Streets that had been full of life that morning were unrecognizable by daybreak. The destruction was almost total, and yet, the almost total destruction of Coventry and of other cities such as Plymouth brought the war not a single second nearer to its end for the Germans. Night after night, week after week, the bombers returned. The people of London developed routines of survival. They learned to read the sounds of the raid, the distant drone that meant the bombers were still far away, the rising pitch that meant they were closing in, the sudden silence that meant a bomb was falling directly overhead. They learned which shelters were strongest, which tube stations were deepest, which basements offered the best protection. They learned to sleep through everything except a direct hit. They adapted, because adaptation was the price of survival. Each of those nights brought its own particular horror. Some nights, the East End bore the brunt, the narrow streets of Stepney and Poplar consumed by fire. Other nights, the bombers ranged further west, hitting Mayfair and Westminster. The Houses of Parliament were hit. Buckingham Palace was hit. The King and Queen remained in London throughout, sharing the danger with their people, and the fact that even the palace had been bombed created a strange solidarity in the rubble. The night shifts in the factories continued through the raids. Workers crouched under their benches when the bombs fell close, then stood and went back to their lathes. Production never stopped. Every Spitfire that rolled off the line was a small victory against the German strategy of terror. For 109 consecutive nights, one part of London or another was savagely bombed. 109 nights of sirens, of sheltering, of waiting, of emerging into the smoke and dust to count the dead and begin again. But unexpectedly, one night, the citizens had their first night off, December the 25th, 1940, Christmas Day. It was an unbelievable break. Families gathered together. Children opened what few presents could be found. For one night, just one, the skies were silent. No sirens, no bombs, no fires. Just the quiet of a winter's night and the fragile illusion of peace, but it was only a break. Boxing Day came, and with it, the bombers returned. And yet, in the days and weeks that followed, something began to change. The citizens became aware that the raids were becoming shorter and fewer. By the spring, they were hardly there at all. The dark skies of winter were giving way to quieter nights. People began to whisper that perhaps, just perhaps, the worst was over. And then, almost out of the blue, the Blitz returned with doubled fury. For many people, it seemed worse than anything that had gone before. Millions of incendiary bombs rained down on the capital, small, deadly devices designed not to explode but to burn, and burn they did. In a matter of minutes, more than 1,500 different sections of the city burst into roaring flames. Flames that merged together, flames that fed on each other, flames that created their own wind, sucking in air from the surrounding streets, and sending columns of fire hundreds of feet into the sky. It was the greatest fire London had seen since the Great Fire of 1666, almost 300 years before. The comparison was not lost on anyone. Below ground, in the tube stations and the shelters, the people of London felt they were back where they had been 4 months ago. The hope that had been building through the quieter weeks of spring evaporated in a single night of fire. It seemed that they were going to have to endure it all over again. The weariness was crushing. The fear was real, but the resolve remained. And then, the next day, to everyone's amazement, there was no siren, no drone of bombers, no crump of explosions, no fires on the horizon, just silence. The people waited. They braced themselves. Surely it was coming. Surely this was just another brief respite before the next wave. But the wave never came. They didn't know it then, couldn't have known it then, but Hitler had turned away from Britain to undertake the conquest of Russia. The Luftwaffe was being redeployed eastward to the vast steppes and frozen plains of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of Russia, had become his new obsession, and in pursuing it, he had made what history would judge to be his most catastrophic mistake. The silence that followed the last bombs was, for many Londoners, the strangest sound they had ever heard. For months, the soundtrack of their lives had been sirens, explosions, the crackling of fires, and the rumble of collapsing buildings. Now there was only quiet. People stepped outside and looked up at skies that were, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, empty of threat. They looked at their battered city, at the gaps in the skyline where familiar buildings had stood, at the weeds already growing in the bomb craters, and they understood, slowly, that something had changed. Hitler had gambled that if he made the British people suffer enough, they would demand peace. He had lost that gamble, just as he had lost the air battle over the Channel, just as he had lost the battle for the airfields, just as he was about to lose the war itself. The Battle of Britain was over. It had been finally won, but not by Hitler. The cost of what had just occurred was staggering. In the skies over southern England, in the burning streets of London and Coventry and Plymouth, a nation had been tested to its very limits and had refused to yield. Hitler had lost 2,375 aircraft and their crews. For the first time in the war, the Germans had tasted defeat. For almost a year, they had struck Britain with their formidable might, the most powerful air force the world had ever seen, backed by the resources of an entire conquered continent. They had thrown everything they had at this stubborn little island. They had killed over 40,000 British people. They had seriously wounded 50,000 more. They had reduced entire cities to rubble. They had left hundreds of thousands homeless. They had bombed cathedrals and hospitals and schools and homes. The physical scars of the Blitz would take years to heal. Entire districts of London remained wastelands of rubble and wild flowers for a decade after the war ended. The gaps in the skyline where churches and office buildings had once stood served as daily reminders of what had been endured. the psychological scars lasted even longer. And yet, when the accounting was done, when the dust had settled and the fires had died and the last all clear had sounded, one immutable fact stood above all others. But from the start, from the very first bomb to the very last, not one single Nazi soldier set foot as an invader upon the soil of mainland Britain. Not one. The beaches that Hitler had planned to storm remained unviolated. The airfields where his paratroopers were supposed to land remained in British hands. The roads along which his Panzer divisions were meant to roll remained the province of farmers and families and Home Guard volunteers with pitchforks and ancient rifles. Operation Sea Lion, that grand, terrifying plan to invade and occupy Britain, was never carried out. It remains one of the great what-ifs of history. What if the RAF had been just a little weaker? What if the radar system had failed? What if the people's morale had cracked? What if Göring had continued attacking the airfields instead of switching to the cities? The margins were thin, the outcome was never certain, and the consequences of failure would have been unthinkable. But the significance of the Battle of Britain extends far beyond the survival of one nation. The Battle of Britain and the people who won it also won for the world a year of precious time in which to prepare for final victory. Think about what that year meant. In the 12 months that followed the Battle of Britain, the United States moved ever closer to entering the war. The industrial might of America began to be mobilized. The Soviet Union was drawn into the conflict, opening a second front that would ultimately consume the German army. The pieces that would eventually lead to D-Day, to the liberation of Europe, to the defeat of Nazi Germany, they all required time to fall into place. Consider what the world looked like in the autumn of 1940. France had fallen. The Low Countries were occupied. Norway and Denmark were under Nazi control. Poland had been dismembered. Austria had been absorbed. Czechoslovakia had been swallowed whole. From the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union, the swastika flew over a conquered continent. Britain stood alone, the last flickering light of democracy in a continent engulfed by tyranny. If that light had been extinguished, who would have rekindled it? Where would the forces of liberation have gathered? Where would the American troops have massed for D-Day? Where would the bombers have launched from to strike at the heart of the Reich? The answers are nowhere and no one. Britain's survival in 1940 was not merely a national achievement, it was a turning point for civilization itself. The cost was enormous. Entire neighborhoods were erased from the map. Families were torn apart. Children grew up in shelters, knowing the sound of falling bombs before they knew the sound of birdsong. A generation of young men was consumed in the cockpits of their fighters, their average age barely 21, their bravery beyond measure, their sacrifice beyond price. In the decades since the war, the memory of the Battle of Britain has taken on an almost mythic quality. The story of the few, those young fighter pilots who scrambled into their cockpits day after day, has become one of the defining narratives of the 20th century. But it would be a disservice to history to remember only the pilots. The Battle of Britain was won by the pilots, yes, but it was also won by the ground crews who repaired damaged aircraft through the night, working by torchlight in bombed-out hangars. It was won by the factory workers who built Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than the Germans could destroy them. It was won by the radar operators who stared at their screens hour after hour, watching for the green blips that meant another raid was incoming. It was won by the Observer Corps volunteers who stood on cliff tops and church towers, scanning the skies with binoculars. It was won by the anti-aircraft gunners who fired into the darkness. And it was won by the ordinary men, women, and children of London, Coventry, Plymouth, Southampton, and 100 other towns and cities who endured the Blitz with a resilience that still defies explanation, who sheltered in tube stations and emerged into the rubble, who dug their neighbors out with their bare hands. Over 40,000 of them paid with their lives. They were not soldiers. They were not trained for combat. They were shopkeepers and teachers and dockhands and housewives and pensioners and children. And they bore the brunt of Hitler's fury, night after night, for months on end. The Home Guard volunteers, armed with little more than determination and whatever weapons they could find, drilled in the fields and manned the observation posts. The land girls took over the farms, feeding a nation under siege. The factory workers, many of them women who had never worked outside the home before, turned out Spitfires and Hurricanes and ammunition at a pace that astounded even the most optimistic planners. The merchant seamen, often overlooked in the telling of this story, continued to sail their convoys through waters infested with U-boats and harried by Luftwaffe bombers, bringing the food and fuel and raw materials without which Britain would have starved. All of them were part of the Battle of Britain. All of them deserved to stand alongside the fighter pilots in the halls of memory. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, not as footnotes in a military history, but as people. People who were afraid and who endured anyway. People who lost everything and who rebuilt. People who, in the darkest hour of their nation's history, found within themselves a strength they never knew they had. The Battle of Britain lasted from the summer of 1940 to the spring of 1941. In the grand sweep of the Second World War, it was a single chapter in a conflict that would rage for 6 years across every continent, but it was the chapter that mattered most. Because if Britain had fallen, if the RAF had been destroyed, if the people had surrendered, if Hitler had crossed the Channel, there would have been no base from which to launch the liberation of Europe, no staging ground for D-Day, no unsinkable aircraft carrier from which American and British forces could strike back at the heart of Nazi Germany. Everything that followed, every victory, every liberation, every step on the long road to Berlin was built on the foundation of what happened in the skies over southern England in the summer and autumn of 1940. The Germans lost 2,375 planes and crew. They killed over 40,000 British people and seriously wounded 50,000 more. But they did not break Britain. They did not invade. They did not conquer. And in failing to do so, they lost something far more important than aircraft and pilots. They lost the aura of invincibility that had carried them across Europe. They proved, for the first time, that the Nazi war machine could be stopped, and the world took notice. Years later, looking back on those desperate months, Churchill would offer his immortal tribute to the fighter pilots who had held the line. But the tribute belongs to all of them, the pilots and the ground crews, the factory workers and the fire wardens, the mothers in the shelters and the children in the evacuee trains. They were all part of it. They all played their part. The Battle of Britain was not won by generals or politicians or grand strategy. It was won by ordinary people who, when the moment of greatest danger arrived, proved to be anything but ordinary. It was won by a nation that looked into the abyss and chose, with quiet, stubborn defiance, not to fall. In every cemetery where the fallen of the Battle of Britain rest, in every memorial where their names are carved in stone, the same truth echoes across the decades. These were people who stood when it would have been easier to kneel, who fought when every calculation said they should lose, who endured when the rest of the world expected them to break. They did not fight for glory or for conquest. They fought for their homes, their families, their way of life. And in doing so, they changed the course of history, not just for Britain, for the world. That is the legacy of the Battle of Britain. That is what those months of fire and courage and sacrifice truly mean. And that is why, more than 80 years later, we remember, because the story of what happened in the skies over southern England in the summer and autumn of 1940 is not merely a story about war. It is a story about what human beings are capable of when everything they love hangs in the balance. It is a story about the triumph of courage over fear, of resilience over despair, of hope over darkness. And it is a story that must never be forgotten. The afternoon of May the 10th, 1940. The old house on Downing Street stood quiet in the spring light, but inside, the machinery of empire was turning on its axis. Neville Chamberlain, the man who had promised peace in our time, had at last proven himself as ineffectual in war as he had been in peace. The pressure for his resignation was irresistible. The people burned for leadership, for inspiration. And so, on that fateful afternoon, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, 65 years old, a man who had spent 23 years in the political wilderness, derided by many as a relic of a bygone age, received the seals of highest office. Years later, Churchill would recall that moment with characteristic grandeur. "I felt that I was walking with destiny," he wrote, "and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." For early that day, before Churchill had even unpacked his bags, Germany had invaded the Low Countries. In the roar of the advancing Panzers, there sounded one clear signal: the phony war was over. Adolf Hitler had at last turned westwards, determined on a knockout offensive that would ensure Nazi domination of the continent of Europe forever. We need to go back. Back to the death of aged President Hindenburg, when the last remaining constitutional hindrance on Hitler's path to absolute power was removed. The once lowly ex-corporal and failed artist, became effectively dictator of Germany, and could now set about molding his country to the great destiny he believed her rightful due. Churchill had seen the danger long before most. While others slept, he sounded the alarm with a prescience that now reads as prophecy. "I dread the day," he warned, "when the means of threatening the heart of the British Empire should pass into the hands of the present rulers of Germany." He predicted, with chilling accuracy, that Hitler's government would confront Europe with a series of outrageous events and ever-growing military might. But his warnings fell on deaf ears. The government, Churchill lamented, could not make up their minds or could not get the Prime Minister to make up his mind. And so they went on, he said, in a strange paradox. Decided only to be undecided, resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful to be impotent. And so the drift continued, until it could continue no more. By September the 3rd, 1939, the war so long avoided, so unavailingly postponed, had finally come to pass. That Sunday, Churchill told Parliament words that carried the weight of a man who had spent years preparing for precisely this reckoning. Outside, the storms of war may blow and the lands may be lashed with the fury of its gales, but in our own hearts this Sunday morning, there is peace. Our hands may be active, but our consciences are at rest. No longer could Churchill be kept from office. After 23 years in the wilderness, he returned to the Admiralty. But the war's opening months brought no glory. Poland was destroyed. Hitler remained ominously quiescent. What was called the phony war supervened, as British troops embarked for France with defense, rather than attack, at the forefront of Allied thinking. One dismal attempt only was made to seize the initiative, the wretchedly mismanaged Narvik expedition, which ended in humiliation. Chamberlain had proven himself wanting, and when the call came at last for a leader equal to the hour, there was only one man who could answer it. Churchill had barely taken office when the catastrophe began. The threat of a German onslaught through Western Europe had been long foreseen, and France had built up an army widely considered to be the best in Europe, reinforced now by 10 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force. The defenses were thought to be formidable. They were nothing of the kind. Belgium was quickly overrun. On May the 14th, the Dutch negotiated a surrender. That same day, Churchill received horrifying news from France, news that would haunt the Allied command for weeks to come. A huge German concentration of armor had passed through the Ardennes, previously thought impassable, ripping open a 50-mile breach in the center of the French defenses. Guderian's panzers were racing to the sea. The German generals were both moving and thinking faster than their Allied opponents. A small British counterattack at Arras could not be followed up. The rout accelerated. The British commander, Lord Gort, fell back to the Channel coast as the Germans, taken aback by their own astonishing success, paused to consolidate. And in that pause, that brief, improbable hesitation, the miracle of Dunkirk began. From the English coast, innumerable boats of every size and description streamed out across the Channel. Fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, lifeboats, ferries, a ragged armada summoned by desperation and held together by courage. The troops waited in long, patient queues on the open beaches, dive-bombed and strafed, wading out into the surf to clamber aboard anything that floated. By early June, they had managed to evacuate 340,000 Allied troops, far more than Churchill or anyone else had dared anticipate. It was a miracle, but a miracle born of catastrophe, and Churchill knew it. It was a deliverance, but Churchill was careful not to dress it as a triumph. Dunkirk, though glorious, was scarcely a victory, and what followed was worse. On the 24th of June, the French government made a shameful peace. Britain was left the last European citadel against Nazism, the final haven for the dispossessed and brave of many nations. To all in London that bright summer of 1940, the future was one of fraught uncertainty. Britain's nearest ally was gone. The United States, still, only a cool friend, was an ocean away. Against this, within 9 months, the Germans had brought off a series of dazzling victories. Hitler was master of Europe, absolute ruler of a dozen nations. His allies were formidable. Stalin's huge Soviet Union, fiercely militaristic Japan, fascist Italy with her modern navy. For Western European civilization, the black abyss beckoned. Only Britain held out. Although she retained her fleet and her vast empire, neither could help in repelling the murderous onslaught already in preparation Goering's terrible airborne battalions. Britain's army was small and badly equipped. Her air force was inadequate to the task at hand. her chances were rated low. It was commonly estimated that, alone against Germany, Britain could last no more than 3 months. And with the extraordinary success everywhere of German arms, the Wehrmacht had acquired a weapon yet more potent than their all-conquering Panzers, a psychological weapon. For the conviction was spreading that the Germans were indeed invincible, that winged victory fluttered always amongst the eagles and swastikas. Hitler could not be beaten. Hope itself was a cheat and a delusion. Nor were there lacking, in Whitehall or in Westminster, those all too willing to share such beliefs who eagerly and cravenly sought to yield on any terms, accept any conditions, embrace any humiliation, merely to be allowed to survive. Hitler's power seemed unassailable, and to the numbed and prostrate peoples of continental Europe, the thousand-year Reich appeared a grim and present reality. It was at this moment, this lowest ebb, that the surprised dictator of Nazi Germany was confronted, for the first time, by an adversary unshakably determined on resistance to the uttermost. Above the tumult of wars and armies, there rang out over Europe a voice marvelous in defiance, ardent in the courage never to submit or yield, a voice full of resolution and faith in victory. "We shall go on to the end," Churchill thundered before Parliament. "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." His masterful oratory thrilled and inspired wherever it was heard. In sullen, fear-laden camps across the huge, bleak expanse of Nazi-occupied Europe, prisoners, often with no other language in common, would exchange in greeting a single whispered word: Churchill. For them, he was the hope beyond despair, and he gave that hope a creed to live by. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," he told the House. "You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war, by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be." Following the armistice at Compiègne, the French Atlantic ports became naval bases for the Germans, who also acquired new and more westerly airfields. The ranges of both their U-boats and aircraft were thereby enhanced. For Churchill's new coalition war cabinet, an immediate concern was the strong French fleet, still intact and in theory controlled by the puppet Vichy government. Were those ships to fall into German hands, the German navy would be much strengthened. The danger was grave. Admiral Darlan refused to commit his ships to Britain. Although the French had so recently been comrades in arms, Churchill could not hesitate. He ordered the Royal Navy to destroy the main French squadron at Mers el-Kebir. "It was," he said, "a hateful decision, the most unnatural and painful with which I have ever been associated, but it was made." For the first time, Churchill drew unrestrained cheers from the conservative benches. Meanwhile, 50 miles north of London, a remarkable secret was being guarded at a rambling Victorian estate called Bletchley Park. Here was assembled the cream of the British mathematical and scientific elite, and throughout the war, they would provide Churchill with one supremely valuable asset: accurate, immediate intelligence. The German military had refined a highly sophisticated encryption machine called Enigma, whose revolving drums could generate literally trillions of combinations. The Germans had every reason to believe that Enigma was impossible to break. Bletchley achieved the impossible. Enigma machines were successfully replicated. Then, with the help of an early computing device known as the bomb, the military codes were broken one by one. The information yielded was given a unique classification, Ultra. It was not long before what Churchill called his most secret source showed its value. From June of 1940 onward, there emerged a steady flow of information on the preparations for the invasion of Britain itself. On the 1st of August, a Göring signal was intercepted. The Luftwaffe was to prepare to eliminate the Royal Air Force with all the means at its disposal as rapidly as possible. Within a fortnight, the Battle of Britain had begun. Against the Luftwaffe's 2,800 fighters and bombers were pitted only 650 Spitfires and Hurricanes. But besides Ultra, Air Marshal Dowding had another incalculable advantage: Robert Watson Watt's radar systems. Dowding knew that if the Luftwaffe gained absolute air superiority, no navy in the world could stop the invasion barges crossing the channel. He conserved his resources with the utmost economy, whilst continuing to meet every raid. After a month, Goering, not knowing how near he had come to crippling fighter command, changed targets. The battered aerodromes and radar stations were granted a merciful respite. Instead, it became the turn of the cities, and before all others, London. Not long before, Churchill had warned and exhorted in words that captured the existential nature of what was at stake. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island, or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. The footage that survives from those nights of the Blitz is haunting London's skyline lit orange by 1,000 fires. But the Luftwaffe had, in fact, been designed for army support, not strategic bombing. And although tens of thousands were left dead and millions of homes wrecked, the damage was much less than forecast. Morale, production, and communications went largely unaffected. From mid-September, Churchill knew, although he could not reveal how, that the invasion was off. His gratitude to the fighter pilots who had saved Britain was expressed in words that have passed into the language itself. Never in the field of human conflict, he declared, was so much owed by so many to so few. And if London burned, the lapping fires touched another flame, one that gleamed ever more brightly across the Atlantic. The hardline isolationists in America were still preponderant, and although both presidential candidates were pledged to keeping the boys back home, American public opinion was beginning to accept that Hitler should be fought. Meanwhile, another unrelenting and no less critical contest was being played out far away on the broad Atlantic. In 1940, the U-boat fleet, while still small, was achieving frightening success against the merchant navy. Escorts were too few. The fiercely neutral Irish Republic would not allow British warships to use her ports. Churchill was anxiously aware of just how dangerous was the hemorrhage in the vital Atlantic supply lines. By October, when he replaced the commander of the home fleet, 2 million tons of shipping had been lost. Admiral Dönitz was perfecting the open ocean Wolfpack system. Fortunately, bad winter weather brought some temporary relief. More than ever, Churchill needed to cajole the United States into the war. That autumn, a significant first step was taken when Roosevelt agreed to trade 50 old and near-useless destroyers for a ring of valuable British bases. The bargain in itself was so poor that Churchill tried to keep the details quiet, but as a token of American commitment, he said, "The destroyers are worth their weight in rubies." Meetings with Roosevelt continued, warm and frequent. Nevertheless, Churchill may have sometimes misunderstood where the enigmatic president's priorities lay. Roosevelt had severe internal problems, and the greater good of the United States was or had to be his first consideration. America would gladly become the arsenal of democracy, but the enterprise would be run on strictly commercial principles. As 1940 drew to a close, Churchill dared not make public his most burdensome anxiety. Britain's lonely struggle was driving her rapidly into bankruptcy. A bill to allow Britain to borrow to finance the war was before Congress. Churchill issued a moving appeal: "Put your confidence in us. Give us your faith and your blessing, and under Providence all will be well. We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." But before Lend-Lease, there came cash and carry. The Americans wanted, first, all of Britain's own gold reserves, then any gold that could be got from allies or the Dominions. All overseas assets, private or public, had to be sold off, often at knockdown prices. Large profits were made on Wall Street. The British-owned Viscose Company, after liquidation, realized $87 million it had been worth around $40 million more. The Americans also wanted into Britain's export markets. Imperial preference was abolished, and in the wider interests of furthering the war effort, Churchill sent over a high-level mission empowered to pass on to the delighted Americans the finest fruits of British scientific and industrial research. Details of the newest discoveries in anti-aircraft technology, explosives, rocketry, electronics, and the jet engine. There was a prototype of the cavity magnetron, which, by vastly increasing the power of radar, allowed it to be carried in aircraft for the first time. All these were goodwill gifts. In the Mediterranean, meanwhile, the war was offering both hope and heartbreak. With invasion still a real possibility, Churchill had taken the bold step of sending 150 tanks to General Wavell in Egypt, an act of strategic daring, for those tanks were desperately needed at home. Thereafter, military involvement in the Mediterranean increased steadily, partly because there was no other opportunity for fighting the Axis powers on land. Gradually, too, Churchill became fascinated with a thrust north through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, a fascination that would shape Allied strategy for years to come, not always for the better. In September of 1940, Mussolini, who already had one large army in Abyssinia and another advancing hesitantly into Egypt, embarked on an ill-conceived invasion of Greece. But it was at sea he sustained his first rebuff. The Italian Navy, albeit of uncertain prowess, possessed some of the most modern warships afloat. Half of them were destroyed at Taranto in an imaginatively daring attack launched from Admiral Cunningham's only aircraft carrier, a raid that, half a world away, was studied with keen interest by the Japanese. Churchill got on poorly with the laconic Wavell, whom he considered unfairly to be lacking in fighting spirit. Yet it was Wavell's finest commander, General O'Connor, who delivered the victories for which Churchill craved. A brilliant 2-month campaign took O'Connor from Egypt to Tobruk and on to El Agheila. By February of 1941, his 2 divisions had captured 130,000 prisoners for fewer than 500 dead. O'Connor was poised to clear the Axis out of North Africa entirely. The chance was lost. Churchill learned through Ultra that Hitler was coming to the aid of the Italians, whose Greek offensive was floundering. And not for the only time, Churchill allowed generous emotion to outweigh sounder instincts. Greece civilization's birthplace had a British guarantee. O'Connor's experienced troops were diverted to a woeful campaign in which landings and evacuations went on simultaneously. It was a Dunkirk without the glory. Meanwhile, fresh German detachments began arriving in Tripoli under a new commander, Erwin Rommel. O'Connor's gains melted away. Rommel besieged Tobruk. Even worse was the debacle of Crete, garrisoned by 40,000 Allied troops. Although British command of the sea was assured, air cover was negligible. After fearful slaughter, the island fell to a purely airborne assault. The disaster was less than it first appeared. German losses of aircraft and elite paratroopers had been too severe for the exercise ever to be repeated. But for Churchill, accurately forewarned of the attack through Ultra and sorely needing a triumph, Crete was a heavy blow. Although Churchill undoubtedly relished power, there were times as more bad news succeeded to worse that he could be deeply cast down and would brood for hours, alone and unapproachable, but never for long. He possessed extraordinary resilience. In the spring of 1941, there was all too much cause for gloom. The Luftwaffe was being transferred east, but not before 2 huge farewell raids on London. During the same month, U-boats sank a record number of Allied ships. Churchill had insisted on action against Rommel, but Wavell's resources had been hopelessly depleted, and when Operation Battleaxe finally got underway, it soon foundered. However unfairly, the scent of failure clung to Wavell, whom Churchill now replaced with Auchinleck. In the incomparably smaller North African theater, Auchinleck finally moved against the supply-starved Rommel in November, relieved Tobruk, and once more advanced into Libya. But yet again, a promising offensive was halted because troops were pulled out 2 of the divisions urgently recalled for the defense of their native land, Australia. The Desert War, it seemed, could never quite deliver the decisive blow. On the morning of June the 22nd, 1941, the world awoke to momentous and earth-shaking news. Hitler had attacked his erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union, throwing in 3 million men, the largest invasion force in human history, over hundreds of miles of frontier, in an operation of breathtaking audacity and monstrous ambition. Stalin had ignored the warnings both of Churchill, who had passed on intelligence from Ultra and of his own military advisors. The Red Army, which had suffered catastrophically in the purges of the late 1930s when Stalin had executed or imprisoned thousands of his most experienced officers, was ill-prepared, under-equipped, and badly led. The Soviet defenders recoiled before the searing onslaught. Churchill had long been a staunch anti-Bolshevik, but his unalterable object was the defeat of Hitler. He at once offered to divert precious British supplies to aid the Soviets, a gesture all the more generous since Churchill, like everyone else, assumed another German victory would follow within months, if not weeks. Hitler himself was sufficiently confident to order cuts in munitions supply, and Stalin cabled Churchill with desperate urgency, "The Soviet Union is in mortal peril." Initially, the German divisions enjoyed their accustomed success, often pushing more than 50 miles in a single day. In huge encirclements, they took hundreds of thousands of captives. At first, Stalin was unable to face the crisis, and for 9 days, the great Soviet ship of state drifted rudderless. Then, finding his nerve, Stalin began organizing a resolute defense. Chaos gradually gave way to order. By December, Soviet casualties were running in the millions, and forward German units were in sight of the glinting domes of the Kremlin. But already there were inauspicious omens. Hitler's shifts of strategy had blunted the main thrust of the offensive. The lines of communication were badly overextended. Having been little concerned with the modernity of their equipment, the Germans were dismayed to find the new Soviet armor stronger than expected, and the pitiless Russian winter for which they were completely unprepared was at hand. At this point, Churchill did not yet know he had gained an ally who would win the war. He was much concerned at unfavorable reaction in the virulently anti-communist United States. In August, he met Roosevelt at Placentia Bay for a cordial but largely unproductive meeting. The two leaders liked each other, but liking was one thing and committing the world's most powerful democracy to a European war was quite another. Stalin, meanwhile, had exerted his considerable talents to the full. Entire factories had been moved east, disassembled and loaded onto freight trains in the dead of winter, reassembled thousands of miles away in the frozen steppe. At however somber a cost to his own peoples, he was rapidly transforming the Soviet Union into a military superpower, and above all, he was choosing commanders on the basis of ability rather than acceptability. Organizing the counterattack in front of Moscow was probably the war's greatest commander, Georgy Zhukov. There would be no more blitzkrieg. Then came the event that transformed the war entirely. On December the 7th, 1941, Admiral Yamamoto's carrier aircraft swept down upon the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, sinking or disabling 8 battleships and killing over 2,000 men. It was a devastating tactical success and a catastrophic strategic blunder, for it ensured, in the most spectacular fashion imaginable, that one of Churchill's most cherished hopes would be fulfilled. America was in the war. Churchill's declaration of war on Japan preceded even that of Roosevelt. The invasion of the Soviet Union had brought a merciful end to the fraught isolation of the 12 long months when Britain alone had grappled with Hitler. Now the world's richest nation was also in the fray. Yet Churchill could not relax immediately. The United States was primarily a naval power, and there was a real possibility she would concentrate on a war in the Pacific, leaving Britain and the mistrusted Soviets to deal with Germany. The suspense was not long. On December the 11th, both Hitler and Mussolini declared war on the United States. Churchill's relief was profound. He was already on his way to Washington, where it was agreed that the defeat of Nazi Germany was the overriding priority. The foundations of a close and unusually effective military alliance were laid. During this trip, the 67-year-old premier suffered a mild heart attack. His physician dared not tell him. Somehow, Churchill's remarkable constitution saw him through. But for 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese zone of conquest spread ever wider. Churchill, still undervaluing the need for air cover, had sent the Prince of Wales and the Repulse to Malaya unaccompanied by a carrier. Both were sunk. In February, Singapore was forced to a wretched capitulation. Its 180,000 defenders led off into a cruel and hideous captivity, and the grandeurs and illusions fostered over 100 years of imperial domination crumbled into dust. Singapore was only one in a string of reverses. British public opinion had been outraged by the Channel-2 German battlecruisers escaping from Brest to the Baltic, slipping audaciously through the English Channel itself. By March, Rangoon and most of Burma had fallen to the Japanese despite their logistical inferiority. Rommel was triumphing in North Africa. A formal vote of no confidence was put down in Parliament. Churchill easily survived it, but remained badly in need of some striking military success. In June, Auchinleck fell back to a defensive position at El Alamein where he was able to hold firm. Nevertheless, in nearby Alexandria, panic reigned. Churchill was deeply depressed. In April alone, 700,000 tons of merchant shipping had been lost. Rations were reduced. The mighty conflict was now at its zenith, with both Germany and Japan at the apex of their conquests. Yet neither empire could be sustained. Slowly but steadily, fortune's tide was turning, and although he constantly hoped and dreamed otherwise, the Nazi dictator knew that he had played and lost. With increasing urgency, Hitler began to implement the last and most evil of all his schemes. Hitler's wars had never been wars of conquest and plunder merely. As Churchill had long proclaimed, they were wars of enslavement and extirpation. Europe's Jews and Romanis were the first to feel his terrible flail. But in the perverted Nazi ideology, the Slavic peoples of the East were also irredeemably inferior. The original Eastern plan was of awesome simplicity: kill off most of the subjugated races, reduce the rest to a debased serfdom. It was soon apparent that machine gunning, starvation, and working to death were methods too slow. More efficient means were found. The ceaseless killing took priority even over the war effort, and by their unvarying brutality, the Nazis greatly increased the resolve and indeed the numbers of their enemies. Nowhere was this more evident than in Soviet Russia. The peasants may have had little reason to feel loyal to Stalin, but the cry of Mother Russia in her agony went never unheard by her children. They spared neither their land nor their blood, and wherever the Nazi invaders advanced, they found only a desolation set about with danger. Disappointed with Auchinleck's performance, Churchill passed through Cairo on his way to Moscow and replaced him with Montgomery, at the same time bringing in Alexander from Burma to be supreme commander. They were two of Churchill's best appointments. Montgomery set himself methodically to beating Rommel, first of all assuring himself of complete superiority in men and tanks. Ultra was again indispensable. Knowing always when Rommel's supplies were due, Alexander could see to it that they rarely arrived. When the Second Battle of El Alamein began in late October, not even a Rommel could save the Afrika Corps. They were steadily driven back, first to Benghazi, then to Tunisia, and this time for good. Though not the most spectacular of victories, El Alamein brought an emphatic stop to a long and miserable train of British reverses. Churchill was delighted. The campaign was followed up almost immediately by the first combined Anglo-American venture, Operation Torch. The landings in Vichy, North Africa, were beset by political and strategic muddles, and the initiative was lost. Nevertheless, the Axis forces were caught on two sides, and by the 11th of May, the whole of North Africa was in Allied hands. Stalin pressed strongly for a second front, an Allied landing in France that would take the terrible pressure off the Red Army. The Americans, too, wanted an early invasion, but needed at least a year to build up their forces. With both Roosevelt and Churchill impatient for action, North Africa was the only feasible alternative. On his way to Moscow to break this disagreeable news to Stalin, Churchill passed through Cairo. It was there that he made the changes in command that would alter the course of the Desert War. In the early months of '43, the U-boats had come near to winning the war's longest-fought battle, sinking 43 ships during the first 20 days of March alone. The Arctic convoys, too, had suffered grievously. Convoy PQ-17, which Churchill had insisted should sail despite the dangerously light summer nights, had scattered after an alarm, and 2/3 of its ships were lost. The hemorrhage seemed unstoppable, but then, just in time, two new British devices came into play: the Huff-Duff radio location equipment, and yet more decisive, the airborne centimetric radar. The hunters became the hunted. In May, Dönitz was forced to recall his U-boats. Never again were they a serious threat. As bombing was still the only way of striking directly at the enemy, Churchill continued to support Air Marshal Harris, who believed he could win the war by bombing alone. With American participation, the air offensive intensified. In fact, the massive raids, while causing many civilian deaths and much wanton destruction, were of negligible military utility. Throughout 1943, German production soared. So did RAF losses. It was the Americans who eventually found the answer: building one of the outstanding aircraft of the war. The P-51 Mustangs were fitted with drop tanks, an old idea, and could not only accompany the bombers all the way to their targets, but fight magnificently when they got there. Precision daylight bombing at last became possible. It was first used in April of '44 against the synthetic oil plants, with notable success. Over 500,000 men were committed to the invasion of Sicily, which began in July of '43. Between the two commanders, the British Montgomery and the mercurial American Patton, an unfortunate rivalry broke out. Partly as a result, many of the German defenders escaped safely to the mainland. But the fall of Sicily had one important consequence. Mussolini had never enjoyed genuine popular support, and now the tattered sham that had been fascism collapsed virtually overnight. Yet the Germans moved swiftly to assert control, and from being an unreliable ally, Italy became merely an occupied country. Not until September were the Allies able to land at Salerno. Subsequent progress was agonizingly slow, in the face of a resistance both obdurate and skillfully conducted. The Germans had a well-prepared series of great defensive lines. Dislodged with painful effort from one, they would fall back on another no less difficult of assault. By early 1944, the campaign was at stagnation point. Churchill's old project for a drive up what he called the soft underbelly of Europe had run into the hardest of bone. In Churchill's mind was a bold project to break the Italian deadlock by striking at Anzio, 60 miles above the German lines. Roosevelt consented to allow landing craft otherwise destined for the Normandy invasion to be kept on for a time in the Mediterranean. When the Americans landed at Anzio in January of '44, resistance was slight, but yet again, inexcusable delay was followed by near disaster. So far from Anzio relieving the Gustav Line, the line itself had to be carried by dogged frontal attack to relieve Anzio. Then General Clark's drive for Rome allowed the Germans once more to retreat in good order. For the rest of the year, the Allies battered northwards. The ensuing winter stalemate lasted virtually to the end of the war. The Italian campaign was the last occasion on which Churchill had a major hand in strategy. History records an open verdict, and on the vast Eastern Front came the best news of 1943. At Kursk, in the largest tank battle ever fought, the invaders suffered a crushing and crucial defeat. From then on, the Red Army had more and better guns and tanks, increasing air superiority, and up to a 6-to-1 advantage in numbers. The Germans could now hope only to delay, never to prevail. Huge campaigns and unimaginable bloodshed still lay ahead, but Zhukov would reach Berlin. With such victories, Stalin's reputation rose sharply, and so, when the Big Three met at Tehran that December, Churchill, despite appearances, was very much the junior player, but one determined, as far as possible, to keep Britain at the top table. The main agreement to emerge from Tehran was that the Normandy invasion, codenamed Overlord, would be pressed forward with all expedition. Italy would be secondary. Churchill could only acquiesce. After the loss of her Far Eastern possessions, British efforts against the Japanese had been mainly directed to securing India and, under American pressure, to the reopening of the Burma Road. Here, General Slim and the 14th Army performed outstanding service, waging a grueling campaign in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. But the war against Japan was largely fought with equal courage and flair by the Americans. For Churchill and war-exhausted Britain, the last great battle would be that through France and into Hitler's Reich itself, the preparations for the invasion of France, despite their immense scale, were meticulous. There was again much friction at high levels throughout. Montgomery advocated a sharp, pencil-thin drive into Germany, whereas the American Bradley favored an advance on a broad front. These disagreements would persist long after the first shots were fired, but the Germans were successfully taken in by an elaborate deception plan. Minesweepers, unnoticed, cleared a passage through the Channel waters, and early in the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, the enormous operation finally got underway. Thousands of air sorties were flown, and despite setbacks, by nightfall, over 150,000 men had been landed on the beaches of Normandy. A few days later, Churchill slipped over for a personal inspection. It was no light or easy task that lay ahead. The German soldier was as sternly resilient in retreat as in conquest, and Hitler could still inspire fanatic loyalty. Nevertheless, within a week, a 60-mile beachhead had been consolidated. On the 27th of June, the Americans captured Cherbourg. The British were still held down in the difficult Bocage country. Montgomery had hoped to take Caen on the first day. In fact, the town did not fall until after a month of hard fighting. By the end of July, the Cotentin Peninsula had been secured, and substantial German forces were in danger of encirclement at Falaise, where their armor was badly hit in repeated airstrikes. The pocket was not sealed quickly enough to cut off all the Germans, but 50,000 prisoners were taken, and the roads out of the Falaise Gap were choked with the wreckage of an army in dissolution. Burned-out tanks, dead horses, abandoned vehicles, the debris of Hitler's once invincible Wehrmacht stretched for miles. The rousing call to arms delivered by Churchill was reminiscent of darker times. Let us go on, then, to battle on every front. Thrust forward every man who can be found. Drive on through the storm, now that it reaches its fury, with the same singleness of purpose and inflexibility of resolve as we showed to the world when we were all alone. Soon after D-Day, in a last futile but vicious attempt at breaking British morale, Hitler let loose with the first of his secret weapons. The V-1 flying bombs, pilotless aircraft loaded with explosives. The world's first cruise missiles came buzzing over the channel with their distinctive, terrifying drone. When the engine cut out, there was a moment of silence, and then the explosion. They were dealt with fairly effectively by anti-aircraft batteries and fighter patrols. But the V-2 rockets, which followed in September, were another matter entirely. These were ballistic missiles, traveling faster than sound. The first their victims knew of them was the impact. There was no defense, no warning, no siren. The menace ceased only when the launching sites were overrun by the advancing Allied armies. By then, 9,000 Londoners were dead. London had endured one final ordeal. The Allied advance continued throughout the summer. On the 25th of August, de Gaulle re-entered his beloved Paris. Shortly thereafter, Brussels and Antwerp were also in Allied hands. Montgomery had been in overall charge only for the initial stages, and on the 1st of September, he had to relinquish supreme command to Eisenhower. It was a moment heavy in symbolism. It was now that the normally cautious British general produced a daring plan to outflank the Siegfried Line. The idea was audacious. A carpet of airborne troops would seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands, opening a highway into the heart of the Reich. Brilliantly conceived but imperfectly executed, Operation Market Garden came to grief at Arnhem, where the British 1st Airborne Division was dropped too far from its objective and found itself facing far stronger German forces than intelligence had predicted. The bridge too far, they would call it. Another promise of a swift end to the war had evaporated. Churchill, despite these setbacks, still displayed prodigious energy. He went to Moscow with Eden. He failed to arrange an accommodation between Stalin and the Polish exiles, the Poles whose country had been the very cause of Britain's entry into the war, and whose fate was now being decided over their heads by the great powers. But in a candid discussion over post-war spheres of influence, Churchill secured Stalin's promise not to intervene in Greece. In December of '44, Hitler tried one final, desperate gamble. For the last time, German divisions moved on the offensive in the Ardennes, the same forests through which the Panzers had burst so triumphantly in the spring of 1940. For a short while, the attackers savored former glories, punching deep into the American lines and spreading confusion and alarm. But this was not the Wehrmacht of '40. Resistance quickly stiffened. The Panzers ran out of fuel, the very oil that the precision bombing campaign had been targeting, and as the mists cleared, they were exposed to murderous airstrikes from which there was no shelter and no escape. In a couple of weeks, the Battle of the Bulge was over. It was Hitler's last throw of the dice, and it had failed. In the new year, another mighty Soviet push brought Zhukov's forward units within 50 miles of Berlin. The Red Army, which had bled more copiously than any force in human history, was now closing in for the kill. That spring, Patton's tanks were scarring the east bank of the Rhine, racing through a Germany that was already unrecognizable, her cities reduced to moonscapes of rubble, her population dazed and starving, her armies disintegrating. The 1,000-year Reich, which had lasted barely 12, lay in its death throes. Roosevelt, the pragmatic, purposeful statesman who had guided America through depression and war alike, died on April the 12th, just weeks before the victory he had done so much to ensure. His nation would emerge from the war far richer and more powerful than ever before. The Allies' progress was not without one dark and indelible revelation. As the armies advanced from east and west, the full compass of the Nazi evil was laid bare for the first time to a horror-struck and disbelieving world. The death camps, the gas chambers, the crematoria still warm, the piles of shoes that had belonged to children, the walking skeletons behind the wire, too weakened even to comprehend that their liberation had come. Churchill's unswerving crusade against the Nazi regime, first as a voice in the political wilderness, then as indomitable war leader, found here its most terrible and most abundant justification. He had warned, year after year, of a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. He had been mocked for his alarmism, dismissed as a warmonger, ignored by those who preferred the comfortable fiction that Hitler could be reasoned with. In these terrible memorials to a nameless depravity could alone be written his eternal vindication. And now his great task drew to completion. But the nature of the liberties for which Britain had fought, the very freedoms that distinguished her cause from that of the dictators, was illustrated in remarkable and, for Churchill, deeply painful fashion. While he was at Potsdam, negotiating the shape of the post-war world with Stalin and the new American president, Truman, the British democracy exercised its inalienable right and elected for the coming peace another leader. The man who had saved the nation was voted out of office by the nation he had saved. It was, in its way, a perfect vindication of everything he had fought for, and a bitter personal blow from which he would never entirely recover. 5 years previously, Churchill had warned the British people that they were entering a struggle for the survival of civilization itself, and had promised them victory. Victory at all costs, he had said. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. He had kept that promise, but the cost had indeed been great. Military and civilian casualties had been considerable. Britain's immense war debts would be a burden for generations. Her cities were devastated, her economy in ruins. Scientifically and industrially, she was firmly relegated to the second rank, entering a long decline from which she would never fully recover. The cost had been high, the terror great, the road both long and hard. But Churchill had led his people to a glorious victory.